deliverables for your videos and the deadlines. So we will be sending out an email soon within this week with all of the different deliverables and the deadlines. So please look out for that. And so for the rest of the webinar, Frederick, would you like to say a few words before you pass it on to Paul?
Sure, happy to do that, Sakina. Thank you, and welcome everyone to this fourth webinar. My name is Frederick Nabig. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator in Asia Pacific, and I really just wanted to remind everyone that we have another webinar. And you know that this is, of course, is a series of webinars, a total of 12. Next week's webinar is on attracting talent and building effective advisory boards. We'll be talking about startup leadership, motivating your team, getting the most out of your advisory board. So you don't want to miss that. Then just 2 words about, and I think Paul will comment on this as well, on how you are able to ask questions during the course of this webinar. So to queue up questions to be addressed towards the end of the webinar, use the Q&A function. If you have comments that you'd like to make during the course of the webinar, you're welcome to do that. Then please use the chat function. So with that, I'll hand over to Paul.
Very good. Thank you, Frederick and Sakina. Great to see everybody. Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Gran, the CEO here at MedTech Innovator. This is our MedTech Innovator live webinar series, which runs throughout the course of the MedTech Innovator Accelerator program. We are an accelerator for medical technology, specifically devices, diagnostic, digital health. And we're focused in this particular series on the Asia Pacific region. So you're talking to some of the experts in these webinars who are based in Asia Pacific, who focus on Asia Pacific. We also have a US program as well, which runs in parallel. So there's 2 different live streams for this. There's the medtechinnovator.org/live, which is our US program, and medtechinnovator.org/APAC live, which is our Asia Pacific program. And that's where you are tonight. So hopefully, or tonight for me, probably today for you. So I'm based here in California, so it's a little bit later for me than it probably is for most of you. But what we're going to be talking about today are a number of things related to product development and manufacturing. And we're going to be obviously leaning towards Asia Pacific specific things as much as we can. But this tends to be a reasonably universal field, whether it's Asia Pacific or US or Europe or otherwise. There are obviously some nuances, but we'll cover some of those during the program today. So the way this works is we have a number of panelists that will be here as experts that we'll be introducing shortly. Also, we have our MedTech Innovator Accelerator companies in Asia Pacific who are on this webinar live right now. They're here as attendees. The questions that I'm going to be asking of the panelists are for the most part driven by advanced questions that were sent to us by our cohort. So the questions that they want to have answered, and that's what really drives the discussion. So you'll hear me asking questions. In some cases, it might be a little bit nuanced, and that's because they were submitted by a company who has a specific question and not just really very broad. But for the most part, we save super nuanced questions for the very end of this. So it's a 1-hour broadcast. At the end of the hour, we end the broadcast and we still have a 30-minute session of Q&A just for our cohort. So they'll be able to ask questions directly of the panelists. But for this first hour, we're going to talk broadly based on the questions that were submitted. So to kick this off, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have with us first, I'll introduce George Sidis, who is Managing Director of the IDE Group. George, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and IDE.
Thanks, Paul. As Paul said, my name is George Citis. I'm Managing Director of IDE Group. We work together with our partners to build better futures. And obviously, if you go on our website, that's the tagline you'll see. But what that basically means is building businesses together based on the technologies that we create together. That's what IDE does. That's how we work, and we do that in a number of different ways. Sometimes as a startup founder, sometimes as an investor, sometimes even as a licensor. and sometimes as a service provider, and that means R&D services, design services, product development services, and contract manufacturing services.
Very good, excellent. Thank you very much, George. And next, I'll introduce Alden Velich from Oliver Healthcare Packaging. Alden.
Hey, thanks, Paul, and thanks for the great introduction. So my name is Alden Velich. I'm the general manager for Oliver Healthcare Packaging based in Singapore. For those of you that might not be familiar with us, we're a 100% healthcare focused packaging company that makes sterile barrier systems for biologics, pharmaceutical, and medical device companies. We've been in business for over 120 years and we've specialized in medical since the early 70s. Today, we're the industry leader and we work with hundreds of startups and thousands of well-established medical companies in helping them launch or scale their devices in the market using sterile barrier systems.
Fantastic. It's great having you both here. We also have Biten, Kathrani from Johnson & Johnson. So Biten, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Morning, good evening to you, Paul. Biten Kathrani. I am based out of Singapore. I had R&D for the vision care business for the Asia-Pac region for Johnson & Johnson. Been in the medical device industry in the R&D innovation seed funding stage for more than 25 years. That accounts for all the gray hairs you can see.
Very good. Well, we will hopefully keep the discussion reasonably light tonight and not make you too much more gray. So do our best. But hey, anything's game here today. As Alden said earlier, there's nothing wrong with being controversial. So we'll see where the discussion goes, but really great to have the three of you here as panelists. Again, the subject we're going to be talking about today is product development, manufacturing, and we may stray here and there into some other things as we go, but really excited to talk about the subject. It's interesting because in our US program, when we think about innovation in this particular space, things are relatively consistent, although there's obviously some differences, as we kind of go across the US. But for the most part, you're developing and you're thinking mainly about US regulatory and US requirements. But now we're talking about Asia Pacific, which is super broad. So as we talk today in general, I may ask and direct some of the the discussion around what might be regional and specific for all of us. So we'll keep that in mind, or even in your answers as you're answering questions. It'd be great to hear if you have any particular thoughts. While you're talking, you might say, and here in Australia, for example, and you might add some flavor to that if that you think that's appropriate, guys. So let's go ahead and just talk maybe a little bit first about how companies engage, or how you engage with startups and scale-ups in the medtech space. So maybe just kind of start off and tell us a little bit about how an early stage company approaches you, finds you in the first place, and how they might think about engaging with you in general as a firm. So why don't I start off with George, and you can tell us a little bit about how you find companies or how they find you, et cetera, and any advice you want to offer in terms of.
Yeah, I think for us, it probably works both ways, that people find us and we find them. There are definitely medical technology interest areas that we have. But I think in terms of that, it's just about reaching out and having a conversation to start with about whether we are sort of like-minded and aligned in terms of where we would like to take a relationship that can build their business and take it forward. And that means engaging on a number of different levels. So as I mentioned, so there's a couple of different startups that I've founded, and there's 6 or 7 startups now that we've actually cash invested in, and obviously that's a deeper relationship and takes a little bit more time and us understanding of their business model, and the path to that is not dissimilar from what you might get from any other investor in terms of due diligence and assessment of their business model, etc. And we also occasionally, and we've done this a couple of times too, is license some technology from startups. So where we've found something that we might be able to find useful, or take into another business model that we have licensed technology as well. And then in terms of doing a more traditional service provider model, the way we tend to work is have a conversation about their needs, work with them around what their business goals are, because that's fundamental to us in terms of the way we work. So whether we're coming in as an investor or a partner or just a service provider, we very much think entrepreneurially. So how do we take what your medical technology is and make a business out of it? That's fundamentally where we're coming from. And so the engagement always starts with us trying to get a deep understanding of what they're trying to do with their business and where they're trying to take it.
Terrific. Let me move over to you then, Alden. At what point do people engage with Oliver Healthcare Packaging, and how, again, how do you generally find startups, or how do they find you?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. So in our case, a lot of the companies, or at least startups that we engage with, usually it's an engineer that worked at a larger, medtech company and then moved into the startup mode. And then, now they're part of that organization, have an existing relationship with somebody on our technical team that they've had for a while. They usually engage them. They usually engage them from that perspective and say, hey, I've started now at a new place. Here's what we're developing. And usually that startup is at some point in the design control element of kind of their development. So they're now evaluating the sterilization aspect. They're reviewing the sterile barrier requirements, moisture requirements, and they'll usually come to us and say, hey, I kind of have a new development or a new design. We're going to use a sterilization that we're not familiar with because that's the only one that seems to be applicable in our initial studies. And here's what we're coming up with. And now they're asking us to develop, design, select the materials, provide the expertise, and make sure, in some cases, we might even do some initial testing to show them that, hey, once you go to third party or want to go to market launch, you're going to be okay. So usually it's through an existing relationship. Our brand, at least in this niche space, is quite prominent. But obviously we also use traditional methods. So through demand generation, normal marketing activities and things like that. Companies do just walked up to us and say, hey, help me understand. Especially in Asia Pacific, what we've seen is you have a lot of people, or in the US, it's more specialized. You have actual engineers that are specialized in just packaging or sterile barrier. In Asia, what we've seen a little bit more of is process engineers or engineers that aren't even specialized in that area coming up to us and saying, hey, I was also given this project to work on. Could you guys help us? And then, we have over 40 engineers internally that are, we would leverage expertise on to help them develop, design, or launch their products in the market.
That's great. And also, Alden, I'm just curious. So is, sterilization, as, for example, as a topic, is that something that you find that, especially the smaller companies, are they aware of it, and are they kind of proactive about thinking through those issues? Or do you find that people show up and they're like, wow, I wasn't even thinking about sterilization, or does it run the gamut?
Yeah, it's interesting, and in the context of startups, it's usually an afterthought. They usually don't consider the sterility piece, or how it's even going to go from, maybe they're using George, he's a contract manufacturer, and they're thinking, how is it going to go from that contract manufacturing place to a sterilizer and then distribution into hospitals? They might not even be considering that element. So in our experience, what we found is that it's an afterthought, comes in later. But it does have, considerable consequences in the sense that if they haven't really selected the right design, the material, there's issues that come up when they try to do or finalize their validation, and now all of a sudden they're seeing a delay in, getting to market because they're failing one element of that. Maybe it's an aging or some other, issue related to the, performance and distribution testing that they're required to do. And now a project that was supposed to launch this year is maybe another 6 or 9 months or maybe another year out before they can actually get it to market. So in our experience, it's mostly an afterthought. And I would say, primarily so with startups, but we do also see it with established, larger medical device companies.
And on the topic of larger medical device companies, nice segue. So Biten. So, I think one of the things that might be I don't know, I want to call it a confusion or maybe a misunderstanding that people might have sometimes is that oh, the companies like J&J only do these things in-house. You work with outside contract manufacturers as well. Is that correct?
Yes, we do, Paul. And I think it's a myth, as you said, that large companies always like to do everything in-house. We have a good balance. We always have purposeful conversations around make or buy decisions. And this involves our supply chain and manufacturing organizations. There are several factors which go into it, right from scale to early new technologies to expertise and efficiency in manufacturing, be it cost, be it volumes. And most recently, when it comes down to Asia-Pac regions, one of the big factors which now drive some of our external manufacturing conversations and strategies are associated with being close to the consumer, close to the market, and therefore being able to also accelerate our innovation potential. Just as an example, if I may highlight, while most of the J&J products, because they are the cutting edge technology, are at a premium range, we also realize that as one of the things which startups should realize is when you want your devices, when you want your products to be used as standard of care, the flip side of that coin is a level of commoditization. And with that comes in a lot of local competition. And you see a lot of that, of course, in large markets like China. And therefore, you have to get into those mid-tier segments, competing with the local companies, and the value proposition for the customers out there is very, very different, and more so in consumer facing devices. For example, the business which I'm associated with, which is Vision Care, where we make disposable contact lenses. Disposable contact lenses have been around for a long time, and while there is a premium level of innovation which is still ongoing, the standard products do get into commoditization, or they have a heavy influence from the local consumers. We have beauty contact lenses, which is a combination of providing vision correction but also providing cosmetic effects, and that has a very heavy local influence. And just recently, and this is public knowledge, so we can talk about it, we've had a tie-up with a company in Asia-Pac, where we have a brand competing in the mid-tier segment, which is manufactured by a partner in Asia.
Fantastic. All right, that's great background. So appreciate that. So let's move on then and talk a little bit about even just how somebody might evaluate a manufacturer, a contract manufacturer, and maybe what some of the potential advantages or disadvantages of using contractors in the first place might be versus doing everything in-house. I know a lot of startups tend to try and say, okay, we're going to do all this stuff ourselves. Maybe later on we'll go out to these other larger shops. What are from your perspectives, obviously, what are some of the best practices that somebody might go through in terms of evaluating a potential contract manufacturer and their ability to even do things like maintain design controls, et cetera. So why don't we start with George on this?
Yeah, so it's probably, from a very general point of view, a difficult question to answer, because I think it does depend a little bit about how specialist what you are deciding to design and make is. Because and I think particularly on the manufacturing side, I think if it's something that you think the manufacturing processes that you're planning to use or will need to use are something that are out there that contract manufacturers do, I think it does make sense as a startup to not invest in all that yourself and to potentially go out and select a contract manufacturer to help you get your products on the market. But that's a very sensible financial decision. However, I think and this is sort of where the product development and the manufacturing comes together, that there's a lot of design, engineering, expertise in coming up with the right design in terms of coming up with, but also in coming up with the right manufacturing process and understanding that, and then selecting the right contract manufacturer do that. So that's a whole level of expertise. It's not quite as simple as if you're injection molding a consumer product. It's just ringing the contract manufacturing place, telling them what you want. But there's a lot to managing a contract manufacturer in a medical device or a medical technology environment, and you need to make sure that you have the expertise either in-house or with a service provider to help you do that. And then in terms of selecting that side, and in terms of how, I think what becomes important is choosing a partner that's aligned with your business goals. So this is something that I think you need to always be thinking about, and it seems obvious, but everyone in the chain that you're trying to engage, it's all a business relationship. So how, as a startup, am I bringing value to them? That's something that you need to have a think about as well, because I think otherwise it becomes very easy for you, and this is particularly the case if you're dealing with large contract manufacturers, that you become a low priority over time. Yeah. So in choosing the right partners, whether contract manufacturer, product development partners, you got to make sure that it's in their interest as well. And that you can create a relationship that's mutually beneficial. That's really, really important.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned before, George, you also invest in companies as well. So there's a lot of benefits that are just beyond just being a contract manufacturer in your particular case. So that's really interesting. And I'm thinking about what you just said before now about relationships and this being a good relationship. So let me move on to that really and just kind of say, like, what are, as a question, one of the things that we get asked a lot are, what are some of the great relationship qualities that you might have experienced between a startup? What's the ingredients for success in this relationship? George, you mentioned a minute ago the having somebody who even knows how to manage the contract manufacturer. And I think that's a really good point, because a lot of these small companies haven't done this before, and they may not have somebody in-house who has that expertise. So I guess the question is, what are some of the secrets to success for a great relationship? And maybe even involved in that, you can also mention, like, where if someone doesn't have that expertise in-house and how to manufacture that contractor, how do they even do that? Are there other consultants or people that you hire in for that? So I'll give this to Aldin and let you chime in here, and then George, you can do the same.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think George made a really, really good point in the last question too, where he said that, look, the startup's strategy or goal has to be aligned with the contract manufacturer. And, earlier this week, we had a meeting with one of the MedTech innovator, startups, and I gave them kind of the same feedback as they were asking that question of who should I choose as a partner? Where should I go with the, contract manufacturing arm, and to what extent? And, my feedback was, in our experience, and we work with a lot of contract manufacturers because they do reach out to Oliver for the sterile barrier systems. What we've experienced is that they tend to specialize into either a certain device classification, maybe higher end class 3 device, or a specific industry. Maybe it's ophthalmics or it's orthopedics or something like that, because that manufacturing know-how of how to produce those maybe product families of devices tends to be in alignment. And now all the raw material procurement, all of the their subsequent supply chains are now in alignment with what they're ultimately producing, and that's where their true expertise lies. So when I think about a great relationship between a startup, small company, and a contract manufacturer, what I'm ultimately thinking about is the device that you want to take to market in alignment with what your contract manufacturer's capabilities are and what their expertise is. How long have they been in business, and then how robust is their existing supply chain to help you not only get to market, but manufacture it in a way that is adequate and follows your design controls. So that's probably the biggest point in almost like a good marriage, Paul. Make sure you're in alignment in terms of goals and objectives, and make sure that the expertise are there for the device that you're looking to do. And I think that addresses a lot of issues that could come later on if you don't necessarily consider those as you evaluate contract manufacturers.
Thanks, Alden. And George, maybe on a related quick question, is it important that the contract manufacturer that you're working with has a similar experience, with a device that is similar to the one that they're coming to you with? Is that important, or is just expertise in devices enough?
Yeah, I think, again, I think it varies a little bit about, so if you're looking for someone to support you with making a sterile product, having experience in that is really, really important. But I think in general, in terms of the type of companies that we're talking to here, a lot of the time you might be doing things that really, that there's not a lot of experience in, or that the manufacturers that work in that specific space, there's only one or two, and they're really big and hard to get to. So sometimes you might have to work with partners that aren't necessarily the specialists that you're looking for. And I would always relate to, because this is one of the things, so obviously you sent us some of those questions beforehand, and the first thing that came to mind in talking about selecting partners is, wherever you go, whatever you do, if you're doing the type of work that you're doing, you're trying to get a new product to market, things are going to go wrong. It doesn't matter if you have the highest expert in the field, that the mistakes might get made, that there'll be something in the plan that doesn't work out the way we hoped. And at that point, you want partners and relationships that are going to stick together at that time. And to me, in terms of evaluating who particularly your key suppliers are going to be, that working hard on developing those relationships is really, really important. And you need to be thinking about when stuff goes wrong in 6 months and I need to raise money, or a milestone I'm going to miss by 6 weeks, and I need to bring something back in to be able to hit a customer deadline. Is this someone that's going to work with me through that? Is this someone that's going to stick by the relationship that with our company and the business relationship that we have? That I have to say that, so when we select partners, and that works both ways, our suppliers and our clients, that I often look for that, is looking for, is this someone that's going to work with us through when things get hard and things go wrong? Because that definitely will happen. And
when you say is going to work with us through that, what does that mean?
Well, I think this is where sometimes, so in positions I've been in, there might be a risk sharing period almost, where so we might take a bit of risk together to get a product out, and so in a very simple way, that sometimes means for us getting paid later sometimes, or having some risk involved, or it might also mean, so in terms of, we might, so I suppose where you might, and I think there's a question here about MVP and minimum viable products later. That's always a judgment call, and sometimes you get that wrong, and what it often means is, when you get that wrong, rolling with the punches and working out how do you address it, rather than trying to point fingers at which party was responsible for making which decision 6 months ago that we all agreed with at the time. That is really important. So what you really want is not having a partner that says, "Oh, that wasn't my responsibility. that was that consultant's responsibility over there." It's about, okay, it went wrong. How can we address this now? How can we fix it? That's the type of relationships that you want.
Yeah, that certainly sounds especially at the early stage, like the kind of partner you want to have. So you mentioned mistakes a little while ago too. So one of the questions I have then for you, maybe I'll go with Biten for this one, which is, what are some of the avoidable mistakes? So you see, you're looking outside at a company, small company, and maybe you're evaluating them as a potential acquisition or whatever it might be, partner. And you see these mistakes and you go, wow, these are things that should have been, these are things that should have been, these were avoidable mistakes. What are some of the ones that you've seen when you're looking at, you're evaluating companies or you're talking with companies, and I'll ask the others as well this question as well. But I'll start with you, Biten.
All right. Thank you, Paul. So I think George and Alden touched a little bit on this, right? So first and foremost is being very clear in terms of what your expectation out of your partner is, right? Are you going there for an end-to-end manufacturing support where you're going to provide them a design and they're going to churn up the detailed manufacturing plan and eventually deliver a manufacturable product and get the validation done and then become your regular supplier? Or are you going to them for de-risking, or are you going them for a specific SKU or a sub module or a component or a sub assembly to be delivered? So it is extremely important to have that transparency with your partner upfront. The second part is, depending on what you want to get done, you got to sit across the table and discuss how your systems and your partner systems are going to talk to each other. More often than not, there's always, even two large companies have two very different systems. They all work on different supply chains, different way product codes get integrated into their supply chain. Quality and documentation exchange systems can be varied between two large companies, and certainly between external contract manufacturing partners or small companies versus large companies. It's not necessary that large company systems are always the best. Sometimes they may be they're more aligned towards large volume manufacturing, versus small companies are more aligned towards high diversity in SKUs, and therefore it requires semi-manual or semi-automated processes. So making sure that information exchange, documentation exchange, product approval processes and exchange are well determined in advance as a part of the diligence process. More often than not, people focus only on the hardcore manufacturing capabilities, but they don't focus on the diligence and dialogue associated with the systems and the data flow. And that's where you start getting some of the surprises. And then the third part is being very clear on the roles and responsibilities. The fact that we are in dealing with medical devices, and therefore every manufactured product going out of the door has a regulatory step associated with that, be it the simple step of approving or releasing the batch post-production. Is that going to be the responsibility of your supplier? Is it the responsibility of your quality person? Have you put the systems and protocols in place in terms of how that is going to be executed? Is it going to be a dual responsibility? And then post the release, two specific things which more often than not are not discussed: product lifecycle management, and the second part being complaint management. Where will the complaints flow from the consumer? Will they go to the manufacturer and they are supposed to, do the initial analysis and then bring it into the OEM's system or the brand system? Or is it a company like J&J working, we will get the complaints and then we are supposed to, bring the information back to the manufacturer? That looping gets complex when you're dealing with an external party, and depending on how you've written your quality plan and your roles and responsibilities in your quality plan, that can have a regulatory impact. So having those conversations upfront and defining those roles and responsibilities and protocols, again, becoming important. More often than not, you'll end up spending time in your diligence process figuring out, do you have the hardcore, do you have the right injection molding technology? Do you have the right precision machining technology? Can you make sterile products? Can you ship enough capacity, right? All those are hard aspects of manufacturing, and you'll get those. But it's these system level things which go around and have an impact as a part of your supply chain and life cycle are sometimes left as a gap, and then you start getting surprises.
Well, surprises are not a good thing. So let's try and avoid those. So maybe just quickly, Alden and George, just quick examples would be useful, I think, of situations where, without naming any names, You started working with a client, with a small company, and you go, wow, again, I really would have benefited if we started working together earlier, and maybe just kind of give us examples of, again, without naming any particular names, but a situation where there's been a significant delay or unforeseen expenses because they weren't working with an experienced manufacturing partner or contractor sooner. So why don't I start with you, George, on this?
Yeah, so I think that a couple of different examples come to mind, and I think it's fun because I'm sure Alden will launch into this as well, because sterility is a really big one. That if you have a product out there and we do a lot of drug delivery devices, as an example, and you can come up with some great ideas and great mechanisms, but if they're not materials or a design that's easy, you have to think about how you're going to sterilize that really, really early. But that really comes into how you design that mechanism, what materials you use, which sterilization process is that suitable for, and I think that's one that we've come across a number of times. And this, I hesitate to say like it's a mistake that we need to fix that was expensive, because sometimes that process can be expensive. It doesn't matter if you started early, because basically, so I'm thinking of one drug delivery device that we did some years ago now. That was a really big part of the design work, about how we could make that product sterile with the different materials that they wanted to utilize in that device. So I think that's a really big one. I think the other one, and this is more from a design perspective, but manufacturing and supply chain is definitely part of that, is that having upfront a very good understanding of who all your stakeholders are that you need to satisfy for your product to get to market. It's the first thing we talk about when we're embarking on a new project. But in the medical technology industry, so whether it's the hospital level, purchasing, surgeons, clinicians, patients, distributors, contract manufacturing, sterile process providers, other people that you need, obviously the regulatory authorities, there are so many potential blockers for a new medical device. And you really need to think each of those through one by one to make sure that what you're taking to market is something that they can at least live with. Obviously, you need to make sure there's certain stakeholders that you're providing a lot of value to, otherwise you don't have a product you can sell. But the other stakeholders in the chain that you need to make sure they can at least live with what you're deciding. And I think that's probably the main one, where someone's got very late in a product development process and it's killed the project, basically because they didn't think about early. And I've seen that happen in very large companies as well, not just startups, but they're very late, all because someone didn't ask a question early to the right stakeholder around whether this would be suitable for what they need or what they can cope with in that environment.
Great. And Alden, George stole your sterilization discussion, but anything you want to add on to that, or?
Yeah. So staying in line with, let's talk about drug delivery systems, as George just alluded to. Obviously we do the vast majority of all the nested syringe tubs. So if you think about, any vaccines in the market today, they kind of start out at that, there's a big tub, there's about 96 or 98 or 99 different vials of drugs. It's all automatic or there's some significant automation there. But to get those nested syringe tubs with a coated lid, sealed, sterilized, and then get them into the market or into further processing is quite complex. So some of the issues that we've seen where customers have really underestimated or didn't really bring us in earlier on in the processes, even choosing what the tub is going to be made of, polystyrene, polycarbonate, polypropylene, has a adverse effect on the sterilization modality, ultimately the coating or the lid that's going to go on top of that, and then ultimately the porosity or the ability of the gassing agent, it could be autoclave or EO, to go in through and get in, sterilize the vials before they get injected with drugs and then out. So we've seen all kinds of issues in the drug delivery space where for us would have been very simple recommendations that we could have made early on to them. in terms of how they would have developed and designed, that then have caused, multiple years of product delay or launch delays. Now that they've had to kind of go back and resource the material from another source, or we've had to provide an alternative coating to them, or they've had to change maybe their sterilization modality or the outer layer of the sterile barrier. So I think, as George alluded, I mean, it's quite common, especially in our space. We see it quite a bit where maybe they had an outside consultant who wasn't as big of an expert as they might have claimed, and then they came to us later and said, "Hey, here's what we got. Can you help us?" And our engineers will usually take a look at that and then provide a more appropriate solution to that.
I'm thinking about time here, and I want to make sure we cover some diverse topics. So I'm going to skip ahead if everyone's all right with that, and I'm thinking a little bit about geography and optimal locations for doing contract manufacturing or manufacturing in general. And there's a couple things that I think maybe whether it's true or a myth, people go, oh, well, the best, the lowest cost place you can go do, work is China. Are there other ecosystems that are good locations to do manufacturing? Maybe, whether it's India, Malaysia, et cetera, Vietnam, are there other places that are, ideal or that are better, pros and cons perhaps for different geographies? Are there anything that you would recommend, or is that really not much of an issue in your opinions? And I'll start with Biten on this when you think about manufacturing.
So, Paul, again, I can talk about a few general aspects which are taken into consideration. It's always a complex decision to make in terms of where you're going to manufacture, right? But taking a cue from a startup perspective, right? You could say you want to be close to a set of stakeholders. So that could be one of your driving factors. And that itself could be, you want to be close to your existing supply chain and manufacturing setup. So you're trying to you will try and find a supplier who can leverage your existing network. So maybe you have a manufacturing plant already and you want additional capacity or a product which can leverage that manufacturing capacity's outcomes in terms of components or its supplier network. So you want it close to an existing setup. Second is you want to have it close to your R&D location, because you want to go through several design iterations, particularly if it's a high-risk new technology approach, and you expect several design changes to happen along the way, particularly if you've launched an MVP product. The third aspect is you want to be close to your customer. Particularly today's time, when you talk about China, as I mentioned about the example earlier, you may be meeting the expectation of a certain consumer segment where you want to be close to that. After that, there are business case related decisions which come into play, which are the affordability aspect, the lowest cost, as you mentioned. But there's also another aspect when it comes down to the costing and the pricing aspect, which is the taxation. And taxation can work both the ways. You are either trying to avoid certain heavy taxations, or you are trying to gain incentives on taxations. In today's time, many countries are putting that into play. Ireland's manufacturing ecosystem for medical devices has grown on the tax incentives they put in play, and they have been able to sustain it for more than 2 decades now. And you've seen a significant part of that happening in Malaysia, albeit not just for medical devices, but for several other industries as well. It started with the electronics industry a couple of decades ago, but you're seeing a lot more medtech companies out there these days. The third aspect, when we talk about the financials of manufacturing, are also associated with local incentives for local manufacturing, right? Again, China is a classic case. They are always looking for the companies to be a local insider. You will have certain benefits, either in terms of your IP protections and or in terms of being able to bid for certain tenders as a supplier to your eventual customers, which is the hospitals. So it is very critical to understand how are you going to position the product, and how are you going to drive the consumption of your product, and your manufacturing strategy sometimes get tied to that. You may be under a disadvantage despite the fact that you might have the most affordable product if you are going to get sidelined in certain tenders, particularly large account tenders, because you are not a local manufacturer. India is also has been looking at through its Make in India program, looking at some of those incentives where certain local value adds are becoming more and more critical. So countries are looking at protecting and localizing the medtech value chain, particularly countries who have had 80+% imports. So you're going to see a lot more of that play starting to come in as well. And then, of course, there are obviously the capabilities and the capacity aspect and the readiness of a supplier and your speed to market aspects which come into play. Are you going to do it in-house, or are you going to go to the lowest cost guy, but he might not have capacity or capabilities which you have today, and they will have to build it for you? Or someone who might be charging you a bit more, but may be able to get you to market faster than someone else, right? So there are obviously those factors which come into play as well.
Thanks. So, really, really interesting points. Thank you, Biten. So, I was thinking before when you were talking and some of the others were talking, George mentioned something earlier about risk and about who ultimately, where does the buck stop? I think was one of the questions that somebody suggested, and George, you mentioned this a little bit, so I'm going to give the question to you, which is, where's the ownership of risk if a contract manufacturer is, the one who's doing the whole thing, then in terms of building the device start to finish, where does the buck stop if there's issues in the field? Where's the ownership of risk?
So that's, I think it depends is the short answer. So I don't think there's a clear answer, because I think the different manufacturers have different sorts of contracting relationships that they employ. But one of the things that's really, really important on that is that and this is something that Biten actually referred to earlier, is being really clear in your contract who is responsible. And if you are intending to try and push a lot of that risk and complaints management and other things onto the contract manufacturer, the thing you have to realize in doing that, you have to accept that that's going to cost more, that there's a price attached to that. So if just simply the time in doing complaints management and the resources required and things like that, there's a cost to that. If you're going to put all the problems of that might go onto the field, all the responsibilities and product liability and all sorts of things, you're trying to push that onto your contract manufacturer, that all has to go into the price as well. So that's sort of a balanced, nuanced thing. But then if you're giving them risk, then part of that is what they'll also want to start to get is control. So this is where, because and this is how I'm going to take my own. If you're up trying to push risk onto me, this is where I'm prepared to take it to an extent. You'll have to pay more, and I want more control around what the outcomes are. So I get to decide what processes we use, what risk management we use, whose QMS we use, because I'm taking on the risk now. I need to be in control of those risks. So I think that there are a lot of things that you need to balance in terms of making that. But in general, so this is where, if I'm talking about the other side and I'm a startup, is that you have to think, if I pass on a lot of those risks on and then start passing on control, on process, what's the value that I'm creating? So suddenly that means a lot of the expertise starts to go to the contract manufacturer. A lot of the back end business starts to go to the contract manufacturer. Suddenly I get very reliant on that contract manufacturer. Part of the reward for taking on that risk is the contractor will want some minimums, lots of things like that. So apologies for the dogs in the background. But sometimes when you're doing that, that might ascribe some of the enterprise value that you're trying to create in your business to your contract manufacturer, and that's something that you got to be a bit careful about.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree on that. So, Alden, let me come back to you on another part of this process, which is, when you're involved with the company, sometimes they're doing work for not only for Asia Pacific. I'm sure they're doing it for other regions as well. So there's a question here which I'll give to a couple of you, which is things that can be done in terms of improving efficiency. And if a company is going to be doing work, they're thinking about doing work. Maybe they're going to launch in India, they're going to launch in Australia, wherever it might be, but they also want to do work in the U.S. and Europe later. Are there some things they can do to be more efficient in that process at an early point, so that they can enter those markets as well from a manufacturing, sterility, et cetera, point of view? So I'll start with you, Alden, on that.
All right, I think so a couple of examples here, but if we just stay in the context of sterile barrier, for us, what we've seen is it's always healthy to take maybe the highest regulating arm into account, and then try to adhere to or follow as many of those procedures as you can, because especially if your plan is to launch in multiple markets at once, and your quality management system and then all of your design controls are following or adhering to guidelines that are maybe at the most rigorous level for the market that you're looking to enter, it makes it easier or maybe a little less difficult to adhere to and abide by some of the other markets that you're looking to enter into. And so in our experience, this obviously does happen, and a lot of the larger medical device companies are where they were maybe primarily a US-based market or organization, and that's where they primarily sold into. They're now moving into Asia Pacific, and what we're seeing them do is they're transferring, in fact, by a large shot, the majority of their process and the quality management system aspects to their operations in the Asia Pacific region, and they're kind of adhering to the same processes, which are exceeding the expectations of the local or regulating governments in the regions they're going into, with maybe some deviations. And so for us, when we get the specifications or the things that they're asking us to do, they're very much in alignment with what we've been doing, all along. And it actually helps, ultimately speed up the validation process and get the product in this region to market faster, because it's something that we've already supported in the US. Now we're expanding that into the Asia PAC region. So that's maybe one example that could translate into, the contract manufacturing aspect, the product development aspect that we see from a sterile barrier side of things.
Great. And George, you want to add anything to that question?
I'll just stop now so I can unmute. But so from my perspective, in terms of choosing markets to go into, I think the business consideration needs to be important. So there's a startup we co-founded about 10 years ago that we chose to go to South Africa first. That's because we knew there was a market for the device in South Africa, and we knew that the regulatory barriers were low, and we could go, and basically we got that product from concept development for sale to South Africa in 18 months. But that didn't get, so the first world approval, or as we would call it, but the first major approval, we had a CE mark. We didn't get that CE mark for another 4 years. So the fact in that startup's development, the fact that we had cash flow early, because we went to a low barrier to entry market first, rather than wait for the regulatory approvals that required. So traditionally, as a startup, you might be looking at a CE mark or an FDA approval first, normally. But in that scenario, we're able to get some runs on the board, some revenue in the door, and that did a lot for those early valuation rounds that we did then. That did a lot for that business and our ability to raise money. So I think having a broad look around where you might be able to sell your product and where potentially you might be able to get something on the market faster, that's something always worth looking at doing as well.
Thanks on that. So we only have about 5 minutes left, if you can believe it, in this first hour. So I'm going to make sure to remind our startups that are going to be sticking around for the end of this A bunch you've already queued up your questions in Q&A, so good on you for that. Please keep doing that, and we'll call on you once we finish this first hour. So please do that. For those of you who are watching this on our YouTube live stream or watching this on the replay recording afterwards, all of the people who are on this broadcast will include information on how to reach them in the notes on the YouTube channel after the video is saved and stored after this broadcast. So you'll be able to get in touch with the people who are on the session as well. So as we close out in the main hour, I want to make sure we get to a couple last things here. So first of all, when you're reflecting on kind of the discussion we've had today, some of the things we've talked about, are there any particular tips that you'd want to offer to startups and the scale-ups, thinking about product development and manufacturing, things that again can help avoid mistakes? What are some key tips and advice you want to offer them? So Biten, it's been a little while since I've called on you, so you want to start with any particular tips?
So Paul, I'll close out by saying there are two or three things you got to keep in mind, right? And there are no big gems, but they are common sense gems here. Number one is when you talk about your product development and R&D part, your manufacturing and your commercial launch strategy, while in the sequence of events they are sequential, in real sense they all have to be happening in parallel, and they all have interdependencies. So the sooner you can identify the interplays and the interdependencies between these three critical pillars of your success, you are better off. So bring those capabilities, at least one or two SMEs into your team early on, so that they can guide you through that, and also are able to talk to your external partners in this journey. Just like you might need a marketing person to help bring in your business case together, it's sound knowledge to, even if you're going to work with an external manufacturer, at least bring in one manufacturing SME who can then be that interplay between your external partner and your startup team. So that's one, or rather two, in terms of driving it in parallel, and then also at least seeding the right capabilities in the early days. And then the third one I would say is, more often than not, particularly when you're either in your startup mode, or even for that matter in large companies, when we do high risk, completely new market development kind of launches, what becomes important is to have a very clear metrics of success. Don't expect that you're going to have a big bang success in the first market you launch with. But having the right matrix of success will allow you to decide which market you go with first. Because your first market may or may not be your biggest market, but it may be the right ecosystem with all the stakeholders aligned to allow you to taste that success. And Singapore, in a way, is starting to play that role in many medtech technologies, and for that matter, Australia is pretty much following up fast on that. And that will also have an impact on choosing your manufacturing partner, which is the key topic for today's discussion. And finally, don't forget your regulatory strategy, because you may do everything correct, and then suddenly you realize that the market you chose to, even with your manufacturing being ready, you might only get an approval 12 to 14 months later, versus you skipped another market which could have given you an approval in 6 months.
Good advice. Thank you very much for that. All right, so let me move on to you, George. Advice or other tips, other thoughts?
Yeah, I think obviously everyone's made a lot of good points, but I would probably come back to around investing in relationships is really, really important. And I think whether it's your product development partner or contract manufacturers, that I think as a startup, you really need to spend time and understand and engage with people that are going to be on the journey with you. That's something. So obviously you want some ability to change if things are going wrong. So you need to retain knowledge and expertise and documentation. But I think in general, what you want is a team of people, and whether that's an internal team or your external partners that are going to be with you for the distance to take you to the product to market. And because otherwise you can spend a lot of time and effort recreating and redoing. And if and I can't stress it enough in terms of how important it is that if you're embarking on a 3, 4, 5 year, sometimes longer journey as a startup, as a product development in this sort of industry, that you want to have a long-term partner that's with you for that journey.
I think relationships have been emphasized over and over and over in the discussion today. So it's very clear to me that it's not just capabilities, but the relationship. And as someone, I think it was Aldin who said before, this is like a marriage. I think it was Aldin who said that. I can't remember for sure, but you can remind me, Aldin, as you give me your advice, if that was you. But I agree with that completely, that, this is not, it's not just going to the lowest cost supplier, as Biten mentioned before. So Aldin, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, quickly. So I think most of the audience here, everybody has finite resources. So the one recommendation that, I would have is, consider doing less, but obsessing about the things that you do, meaning don't try to enter all markets and make all the devices for all the products right out of the gate. Pick one or few things, but be very good at those. Mishaps early on in the development process can cause significant delays and issues later in the launch. And you might oversee them if you're trying to be everything to everyone. So, my biggest recommendation would be, develop an efficient and effective QMS system. Just make sure you have that in place and ensure your design controls are adequate, fair, and robust. And I say fair because I've seen some unfair expectations at times from medical device companies. And then, make sure to invest time thinking about both your initial launch as well as your scale up later on, because your business will change in many aspects. So just be aware of that. So just take those things into account. And again, consider your resources, where you want to go first. I think George had an interesting example with South Africa. Maybe initially that's all it takes to kind of prove a concept out and show that you can do it, and then go from there. So that would be the, last few remarks I'd have in terms of just things for you guys to consider and be aware of as you decide to go to market.
Great advice from all of you. We had a ton of questions that were submitted in advance that we didn't get to, so I'm glad that we've got another 30 minutes to do that with our startups. But I'm glad you added some of those last pieces of advice about quality management systems. Thank you for that, Aldin, in that last little bit, because having just super high quality across the board, I think, in all of your best practices are super important for our startups out there. Don't try to cut corners. Obviously, you want to be frugal in your innovation, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you're doing things that are going to be transferable, that are going to be smooth as you move, as you scale in general, and you're not going to have to start over. You're not going to have to go back and redo things that you should have done right the first time, because there's not many second chances in this business. Especially when you're trying to go back for capital. So great advice, everybody. Thank you for that. So again, we're going to conclude the broadcast here for the YouTube Live. So for anyone, again, who wants to follow the series, medtechinnovator.org/APAC Live is the location where you can learn about these broadcasts, the ones that we have coming up. We've got a number of really exciting sessions coming up in the coming weeks, and you can see the whole agenda there. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can subscribe to a mailing list in advance where we will send out advanced emails to let you know about upcoming webinars so you don't forget about them. So I'm really happy that we're able to offer that as a resource. Please share this with others. I think, as you can see, there's a lot of great discussion here, and I think things that will really benefit a lot of people. So please do share that. I'm glad everyone tuned in today who's doing that either on the replay or on the live stream. Last thing before we close this out for the live stream, anything else from that you want, each of you want to say in terms of how to reach you? Again, I mentioned I'll put some contact information on the YouTube channel, but anything else in terms of getting in touch with you? I'll start with you, George. Are you easy to find?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, idegroup.com.au would be the first place to look, and please feel free to drop us a line or an email. And my email address is george@idegroup.com.au. Feel free to reach out. Very happy to hear from any of you.
Thanks, George. And Aldin?
Same here. I mean, oliverhcp.com is probably the easiest way to reach us. Just go to the contact us page and send in a note, and reference my name, and somebody in marketing will get you connected to the right folks. So look forward to any inquiries or additional questions that you guys might have.
Thanks. And B10. How about you reaching?
Always happy to work with any of the passionate innovators. Happy to help in any way I can. Best way to reach me, my email address is complicated, so best way to reach out is LinkedIn.
LinkedIn, good. Okay, I'll make sure people have that address as well too when I post on the page. All right, thanks guys. So all of you stay on, don't leave. Anyone who's on here from our startups or from our panelists, I'm going to go ahead and stop the live stream. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see those of you who would like to continue tuning in next Wednesday, same time.